Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 233. PyCoder's Weekly included over 1,500 links to articles, blog posts, tutorials, and projects in 2024. Christopher Trudeau is back on the show this week to help wrap up everything by sharing some highlights and uncovering a few missing gems from the pile. We share the top links explored by PyCoder's readers. We also dig into trends across all the articles and stories this year. We highlight a few gems that we didn't cover on the show and a couple that explore the overall themes of the year. We hope you enjoy this review. We look forward to bringing you an upcoming year full of great Python news, articles, topics, and projects. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Christopher, welcome back.
Hey there. First episode of the year.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to cover a lot of 2024 as far as PyCoder's. We're calling it our PyCoder's Weekly 2024 top articles and some missing gems and some interesting shout-outs. So I'm excited to dig into it, but we'd be remiss if we don't include some news since there's actually quite a bit of it. So you ready to dig into that?
Yeah, for sure. This is what happens when you don't have a PyCoder's episode in a while. We've got lots of news.
Yep.
Let's start out with a plethora of release notes. Plethora is fun to say. I don't seem to be able to spell it without help, but this is an audio format, so that doesn't really matter so much, besides me admitting to the world that my written documents are filled with squiggly little red lines. Where was I? Right, so let's do this rapid fire. NumPy 2.2 is out. There was a security release for Django, meaning 4.2.17, 5.0.10, and 5.1.4. And similarly, there was a bug fix release for Python, giving you enough numbers to pick and buy your lottery tickets. So 3.9.21, note I started with 3.9, 3.8 is officially dead.
Yeah.
3.10.16, 3.11.11, that's just fun. 3.12.8, and we're already on 3.13.1. Now, yesterday, when I was putting all my notes together, I had the intent of making a sarcastic remark about there being no alpha this week. And then, guess what? My inbox this morning, sure enough,
Ding.
add Python 3.14 alpha 3 to the list.
Yeah.
So there's a release for everyone.
Nice.
Two more news things. Both are conferences. So PyCon US 2025, which is in Pittsburgh and will be from May 15th through the 22nd, is now open for registration. And PyCon Austria 2025 has issued their call for papers. Their call for papers is open until March 15th, and the conference is in Eisenstadt on April 6th and 7th. So if any of that is interesting to you, we've got links in the show notes for you to check out.
I think we have one other extra one. The PSF has a year-end fundraiser membership drive, and it's a page that talks about kind of a whole bunch of things. I'm not sure. It doesn't have quite a deadline. I mean, it does say year-end, so we're just past that, but at least has a lot of the information about becoming a supporting member, joining, where to donate to the PSF, and then it has some nice highlights from 2024, things like changes to the grants program and so forth. There are also a couple new roles that have been filled, which we've mentioned in passing, but a couple additional ones, like there's a couple new critical infrastructure staff that have been added. So check that out.
And in case you're curious, the money for that goes to things like PyPI and the security folks and helping out with conference funding and all that kind of good stuff. So it's a good use of the cash.
So you have some news. A
couple of announcements. Sure.
Yeah.
Announcements is a funny way to pronounce self-promotion. So, So I had the pleasure to be invited to Alan Weima's podcast, Flying High with Flutter. For those who aren't familiar, Flutter is a GUI toolkit for the Dart programming language. And if you're wondering why the Python Django guy would get invited there. Well, Flutter gets used for mobile dev a lot, and Django often ends up being the back end in that stack.
Okay.
We live streamed it, so there was the expected, but Python is slow conversation from the crowd. But most of it was how to use Django and especially the API toolkits like Ninja and Graphene for your mobile work. Episode is slated to come out on January 1st, which is the future from this recording, but a couple of days in the past of our release. So you should be able to go check it out if you're curious.
Should be available. Nice.
And the other bit of self-promo is both Mr. Bailey and I have joined the social media platform Bluesky. A lot of the Python community has moved there from Twitter. If you're headed over there, follow us and join the conversation. One of the features that Bluesky has is the ability to curate lists of folks to follow. These are called starter packs. So for example, if you're interested in Python people, you could click on Michael Kennedy's Python Personalities Starter Pack and either follow everyone in the list or pick and choose from them. In fact, Rodrigo Hiraro Soreo, which I'm going to butcher until he gets really angry at me, even posted a collection of these starter packs. So there's one for the PSF board members, another one for Python authors and teachers, a list of folks in the community, and then Michael's list that I just mentioned. So we'll link both to our accounts and Rodrigo's posts so that you can check out the starter packs if you're getting started in Bluesky. And
yeah, I think it's a great way to get started on that platform. I'll give you a bunch of people to follow. It's something that is unique in these services. Usually that was something where it was like you were told who to follow by the platform, and here the members of the community are building these things in very specific, which I think is great. It's a kind of a neat thing for 2024, if you will, a social network that's being a little more, since we are all about links here at Real Python and this podcast and PyCoder's, having a platform that is all about links is really great too, that is part of the web as opposed to being a walled garden.
Yeah. And that's it. I'm done. I'm tired. It's your turn to blather. So I'm going to mute my microphone now and you can chat for the next 35 minutes. Go talk to yourself.
Okay. I get the pleasure of covering the top articles by our own estimation. We've done this the last couple of years, I think, and we've wanted to just talk about, okay, what are the popular things as far as the PyCoder's articles? So some of these things you may be familiar with already, and it was just sort of an interesting set, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So these are the top 5-ish. I added an extra one here, so I'm cheating already. So the first one is probably the most fascinating one of the bunch. It's build captivating display tables in Python with great tables. And this is one of the podcast episodes. It's episode 214. And I had Richard and Michael from Posit on, and they came on to talk about creating these beautiful display-ready tables. It's a really neat package called Great Tables that is coming from the R world. It was a really great conversation. But I think people were maybe excited about the idea of making display-ready tables, which is a little different than, a lot of data science people, you end up just seeing just a straight-up data table, something that's, a data frame out of pandas or polars or something like that. And this is more like the kind of stuff you'd see like maybe in a magazine or see in a really well-done presentation. And it gives you all these great tools to make things look really beautiful as far as tables, just like you do with graphs and charts and things like that. Definitely check it out. The second one is titled Overview of the Module itertools, and this is by Rodrigo, somebody we just mentioned a little bit ago. We featured a handful of things from Rodrigo in the past. The article proposes the top 3 iterators that are most useful from the module itertools and classifies all of the 19 iterators and 5 categories, and then provides usage examples inside of it. He's a great instructor. He really likes to teach through his blog. And he's, as we mentioned, a good person to follow on social media because he's always linking to good resources and so forth. So that one's from Rodrigo. The next one is another bit of a surprise. It's a video course, and this is from our previous guest and Real Python core team member, Philip Exeni. It's titled Customize VS Code Settings. What's unique about it is you download the stock version of VS Code, and it has a lot going on. It's a little cluttered to look at. And one of the things that we've had to do as we've created video courses internally at Real Python is figure out ways to declutter it a bit and make it a little more presentable for showing the Python and not so much of the Chrome of the interface and so forth. So this talks a little bit about that. It also, my favorite part of it is showing you how to manage the settings, meaning that you can save these settings. And since VS Code is available on pretty much every single platform in OS you can think of, you can just copy those settings across and have the same kind of look and feel. So it's more not necessarily, like you need to have it look this way, but how to touch all those buttons and get to those controls and then move those settings back and forth. So a lot of nice tips and tricks for wrangling the look and feel of a very popular IDE. The next one is what I usually feel is a very common thing at the top of our list. It's titled Modern Good Practices for Python Development. So kind of a wide-ranging article. This is from Stuart Ellis. The one funny part of the whole thing to me is that in red, the biggest piece of advice that is like a big shout out is avoid using Python 2. And I don't even think that I even hear that anymore. It's interesting, but it is true, good advice. Like, we're well into the Python 3 era, as you can tell by the list of updates you mentioned. Python 3.8 is off the list now. So this is a big list of suggestions, very opinionated, giving you ways to get started using Python. And I don't know what else to say. It's so huge. I do like that it starts with talking a little bit about installing. I still have my qualms with how a lot of people like to suggest how to install Python. I still think going to python.org is the best bet, but he has suggestions on developing Python projects using certain tools and then formatting your code, suggestions about code linting and testing. And then he gets into very specific Python stuff, language syntax, using datetime objects with time zones, application design, and then some specific libraries. So it's a very good collection of stuff, modern good practices there. The next, where would we be without a top list, without talking about speeding up Python?
I've heard it's slow.
Yeah, exactly. This is titled Async IO Event Loop in Separate Thread, and it's by Jason Brownlee. His site is titled Super Fast Python. The async IO event loop runs inside your main thread, but as that's the one that is used by the interpreter, sometimes you may want the event loop to run in a separate thread. So the article talks you through why and how to set all that up. So again, ways to kind of work with threads and then work with inside the async IO event loop and managing that. I have extra mention at the end of this. We mentioned Lay It On Us so often on the show, and I wanted to call out that number 6 would be Python protocols, leveraging structural subtyping. Protocols, they specify the methods and attributes that a class must implement to be considered of a given type. You learn about not only Python's protocols, but how they can help you get the most out of the type hint system and static type checkers in working inside of Python. So any surprises for you, Chris? I can maybe mention mine first if you want.
Sure, go for it.
Okay. Again, I'm excited to see a podcast episode get the attention, of course, but especially because it's one of my favorite ones. I really enjoyed talking to those guys. I talked to a bunch of data science people this year about a lot of different packages. I'll mention some more coming up later in this show, but I feel that some of these things don't get as much attention, and they really make a difference, in your projects, especially for people that are doing day in, day out, working with data science. And there's some real movement there when there's so much AI stuff getting mentioned all the time. Last year, we had lots of mentions of other like languages for writing an AI and things like that. And so we didn't have as much of that this year. It's really interesting to see a video course in there, though VS Code is an extremely popular tool and it's free. So that's kind of those go together there. The customization thing is an interesting angle. That was like kind of one of the introductions I had to a lot of podcasts when I got deeper into programming myself, and thought of that as, well, that's something I could maybe check out in podcast form. Customizing your setup is so popular, and talking about what editor you're using and all these kinds of things. I think part of that whole thing is people just get very excited about suggesting how to do that sort of stuff. Getting started suggestions is always an evergreen thing, where to start. And so I feel like it's kind of a cross section, a vivisection of the articles.
Yeah. And that's kind of sort of where I think everything in the top 5 surprised me. Like if you'd asked me what was going to be in the list, I'm not sure any of these would have been what popped up. But then when I saw them, it was like, oh, that makes sense. But there was just a little bit of a, yeah, that, if you'd asked me to make a list, this wouldn't have been it.
Yeah. Well, you get a chance here in a moment.
And there's Michael Kennedy recently had a guest post on the PyCharm blog talking about trends in Python in 2024. And we'll link to it because it's a decent little article. But one of the things he kind of wrote about was the diversity of the community. And in fact, he pulls in one of the graphs from the State of Python survey. There was a question, which is, how long have you been programming in Python? 25% of respondents, it's less than a year. And so for those of us who've been at this for a while, like there's certain articles that you sort of like, pick a blogger and they've all done a version of decorators, right? And right. In fact, I was curating the newsletter this morning, and sure enough, up popped another article on decorators. And because you see it over and over again, it's hard not to remember. Sometimes it's like, well, but that's going to be the first time someone has seen. That's the first time 25% of Python programmers will have seen a decorators article, right? So
yeah, there's somebody born every day who
exactly. And then, the flip side of it is half of respondents had more than 3 or 5 years. I can't remember what it was. So it's kind of, on one hand, it's surprising. On the other hand, it's kind of not surprising that you get things like, how do I configure my editor? And then on the other side, you've got, I want to do this really complicated thing with coroutines that I probably shouldn't. And both of those are in the top 5 list, right? So
yeah,
I think it kind of speaks to the breadth of the folks who are interested in this stuff, and I guess the breadth of skill sets in our readers.
I think the one fascinating thing is the thing that's missing. Like, where's the Python 3.13 stuff?
It's there. It's just a little further down the list. So
yeah,
I'd have to go back and double check, but I think 3 of the release candidates are in the top 100. So
yeah,
it was buried a little further down. The article content that was generated on it didn't get that much, but the actual, hey, here's a release candidate, go download it, did. So there was stuff.
I don't want to call it a big or small release. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into all this sort of stuff, but it definitely was not a newsy release.
Yeah, so much of it focused on the back end of it, which is fantastic. And I think it's setting the groundwork for some good things coming. Yeah, there was no anger about the walrus operator or anything like that would cause all sorts of fuss, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny how I'm back to the 25% of respondents less than a year. I'm dating myself because that's an argument from 5 years ago. But anyways,
yeah.
In addition to Michael's post, there was another sort of year-end wrap-up one that I came across that I thought was useful, which was Carlton Gibson wrote a State of Django in 2024 as well. So if you like these kind of, year in review kind of articles, we'll link to both of those so that you could check them out.
Yeah, cool. I mean, the other big news in Django this year was somebody put out a book, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether that was newsworthy, but buy more copies and maybe it will be. How's that?
There you go. All right. I guess that would be the other question. As somebody looking at this, I don't know in some cases that what we feature on the show is definitely stuff that we're a little more interested in and so forth. Did you notice other trends that you want to mention as far as the articles and stuff kind of coming in that was submitted?
I think most of it's the stuff that you kind of expect, right? Spoiler alert, you're going to be talking about this later, but UV was sort of was the big bang of the year. There was a lot of content on that. You also get flavors of this. I subscribe to a half dozen different newsletters and in the Python space. And some of them, it was like all AI all the time. Like almost everything was LLM this, LLM that.
Right.
I tend to sprinkle that very lightly in. So what one editor considers news is not necessarily what another one does.
Yeah. I mean, that was the hard time. And I definitely like to focus on the stuff that people can interact with it. And very often the AI stuff is very startup-y and sometimes very unactionable. Like there's not much you can do with it. I guess Simon would be the one. Simon Willison is like the one person I think that's kind of, finger on the pulse of what's happening with AI. And I'd like to get him on the show next year. That's definitely a goal, or I guess I should say this year, 2025 here. So.
Yeah, and the articles in that space that I've liked this year, there have been a couple that were more of the hey, here's a neat project you can do and use that API
There you go.
rather than like the math behind it, right? So we linked to an article recently which was building a little mini Django website, consuming all of the content from Wikipedia, feeding that into a chat engine, and then essentially giving yourself a natural language interface to the data inside of Wikipedia so you could ask it questions, right?
Yeah.
And from a programming standpoint, this was because all that AI stuff is hooks through other people's libraries. This was really only 3 or 4 hours worth of work, right? So I find those articles more interesting, like what people are doing with this.
Yeah.
Rather than the argument about how many look aheads and all the rest of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's partially just because I'm old and I have survived several AI winters and I'm looking forward to the next one. So we'll see how that goes.
I don't know if I want to talk about it, but the Sam Altman moving the goalpost stuff, I don't know if you've been following that, of like, he's saying that, yeah, AGI is much closer than we really think. And, it's really not going to be as impressive as we think.
Right.
And it's like, okay, those are really interesting things that are maybe getting you out of some kind of contract that has the word AGI in it. Anyway, you can follow news on the Verge for that kind of stuff if you want.
Yeah. No, I did research in this space in the 90s when I was in university. And at the time, it was the middle of an AI winter. And it was because of everyone had been doing vision processing, right? And everyone just assumed because that problem had almost been solved that AGI was just around the corner. And like the research is now what is helping self-driving cars be able to do that. So it's not that benefits doesn't come out of it, but
right. And it's like kind of the NASA thing, right?
Yeah. One of the profs I worked with kind of sardonically commented, and I think he stole the quote, but it was basically, we define AI as the things we don't know how to do yet. And then the computer science people come along, take one of our algorithms, and it becomes the norm, and therefore it's no longer AI, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah, that's just vision processing now. That's not really artificial intelligence anymore. So the goalposts move both in the positive and in the negative, right? So
yeah, it's just pathfinding and video games.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah.
Games,
it's min-max optimization. Nobody considers that machine learning anymore. That's just how you do it, right? Yeah. So
yeah. This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It explores how to send messages across a network with Python. The course is titled Programming Sockets in Python, and it's based on a Real Python article by Nathan Jennings. Your video course instructor is my co-host Christopher Trudeau, and he takes you through a review of the networking concepts used when writing sockets, the tools and techniques to get you started exploring sockets. You'll write a simple socket server and client, and then an improved version that handles multiple connections simultaneously using selectors. You'll wrap up with a server-client application that functions like a full-fledged socket application, complete with its own custom header and content. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. So we did want to pick a few others, some gems, as we mentioned at the top there, to unearth out of it. And what's your first one?
Yeah, so I've grabbed a couple articles that were in PyCoder's, but we didn't highlight in the podcasts, due to space or time or whatever. The one I'm going to start with was back in September. We linked to an article by Ari Lemstein titled Why I'm Switching to Polars. Ari's most recent job was a data science engineer at a marketing analytics consultancy company. So as his title implies, he's mucking around with data a lot, spends his days in R's and pandas, but at the time of the writing had recently sort of switched over to Polars, and the post was kind of talking about why. He doesn't spend much time knocking pandas in it, just sort of praising Polars for what he felt was a more intuitive approach. He starts out, and maybe this appealed to me because of the teacher in me, but he talks about something called Bloom's taxonomy. This is a tool for training trainers, which conveys the levels of progress in knowledge. It's often depicted as a pyramid with the bottom bottom rung, the base of the pyramid, whatever you want to call it, is the phrase remember. And what this means is if you can't remember a thing, then you can't possibly learn it, right? That first step is remembering it. And then it progresses up through a list. And at the top is that whole sort of creation. So you've got enough knowledge that you can create new work or build on top of the work.
Yeah.
So Ari felt that the Polar's syntax was easier to remember. And as such, he found he wasn't fighting the bottom of the pyramid anywhere near as often as he was to just use it to solve a data question, which is, of course, what he's trying to do. So to highlight his point, he goes on to show a very simple data filtering problem. Read some content in from a CSV that's got US counties inside of it. Filter that data for all the counties named Washington. For our non-US listeners, it seems like every county is named Washington in the United States. There's a lot of them. And then selecting out and subsetting some columns from the result. So in Polars, you use the filter function to subset the rows, then chain a select function to get the columns out you want. And the beauty of this is the operations have names, and the row and column operations are distinct. So you're not going to, it makes this easy to remember, right? That surmounts that first step of Bloom's taxonomy, and you're less likely to muck it up. By contrast, pandas can be a bit messy. So Ari figured that this was going to be a .lock thing, or maybe a .ilock thing. So he headed off to Copilot to get a suggestion. Copilot said, oh, don't use .lock, use square brackets. And then it was like square brackets in square brackets in square brackets. And so he went, Copilot, is there another way? And then it's like, oh, sure, you could use .lock and then just 2 levels of square brackets. And the query quickly started to look like a Perl program, lots of punctuation, not much clarity. I kid the Perl programmers. I used to be one. I still have line noise nightmares. Go Google line noise, young children. Anyways, Ari's preferred R library is something called tidyverse, which takes a similar approach to Polars. And again, by using names, makes it more reasonable for a human to figure out. So if you're a data science dude or dudette, this post has a nice little comparison between a couple different languages and 4 different libraries, and might help you change your mind about which one you want to use. So one of our hidden gems from this year.
So I've probably talked about my working between R and Python a lot as I was learning both about the same time when I was in this marketing job. And I was learning about the tidyverse in R just right away, the names of things, the names of these actions, and the chainability of it, which became more of a thing, I think, in pandas as we've kind of gone along, made it really easy to think in my head, like how I want to structure stuff. And that was something I really enjoyed about it. So I was always looking at ways to kind of get that stuff over. And Polars definitely does that. And, I had Wes McKinney on the show this year, and we talked a little bit about, kind of where pandas came from, and that he was working in finance, and we discussed the whole idea that it's kind of built upon NumPy, and there's a lot of these interesting limitations about when he built it and how it was built, and then kind of like moving it forward. I added the subtitle to the episode of improving the data stack and making composable systems, the idea of breaking apart these systems and making it so that things can interoperate. And then that was interesting. That was episode 193 that I had Wes on. And then in episode 224, I had Marco Gorelli on, and we talked about narwhals, which I feel like is like this other trend of like this idea of building tools to help the tool makers, in this case, helping people be able to move so that their library can support all the different things that they can do in pandas in Polars also, instead of having to write all of that themselves. So that was really sort of this data frame compatibility layer that you can basically add narwhals in. And that was discussed briefly in the Great Tables episode, which I mentioned earlier, and then kind of came up again. And I wanted to feature, I talked about in episode 230 very recently, Marimo, talking to Akshay Agrawal, and he came on the show to talk about that, reactive notebooks. And he actually does use narwhals there to help with their ability to go back and forth. And so that really has been a trend. And I think it's partly what you're saying, just this idea of it's much easier to kind of conceptualize in your head, I think, a lot of the ideas that are inside Polars. So what I am featuring here, kind of as a transition, is an article from this May that's from Akshay that is titled Lessons Learned Reinventing the Python Notebook. And yes, I had him on the show recently, and I think everybody knows how much of a fan I am if you've listened to that episode of Marimo. It's an open source alternative to Jupyter Notebooks, but it's so much more. And I like this article. I think I don't know how many times this year we've talked about programming techniques, design aesthetics, and like planning in advance what you're doing, all that sort of stuff. I think it's a really great article in the sense that he describes his whole process. He created a big design document, and I feel like so many coders just go and they build the prototype, which we talked about, which can be sometimes disastrous because you sometimes are stuck with the prototype. And he really wanted to make sure he didn't do that. He had these pillars of things that he wanted. He wanted the notebook to be reproducible, well specified as far as the execution order, while still allowing interaction. And he wanted it to be maintainable. A key thing that he really wanted, that it would be pure Python so that the code would be versionable and be portable. And then he wanted it to be multi-purpose so that it could be like on a web app, or it could be executed as a script or be used like in a pipeline without any extra hoops. And so this whole piece that I'm mentioning here of the lessons learned shows all of that. It shows his work as you're going along. There are some interactive Marimo notebooks, which is one of these great things. We talked about how it implements PyScript. And so you can kind of see some of those windows inside there and get to play with it a little bit yourself. The big goal of it was, how can he make this thing not have hidden state, which is a big problem with Jupyter Notebooks, where you can run cells out of order if you want. And so the state isn't obvious by just reading through the cells of a notebook linearly. In this particular case, he had to come up with an idea of how could we do that. So he uses a DAG, a directed acyclic graph. And so every reference is sort of connected inside of it. And it's very reactive in the sense that if you change a variable, it changes across the entire notebook. It actually scans through the notebook and runs that. And it's pretty impressive. The maintainability thing that it talks about, a lot of notebooks store information as JSON. If you were to look at what a Jupyter notebook looks like, it's hard sometimes to even just see the Python code inside of it. And he really wanted it to be a pure .py file that adds this whole idea of it being Git friendly. It adds the ability for humans and computers to read. You can look at the diffs between stuff. It could be importable, which is something that is really hard to do with notebooks. So you can import it as a module. You can also run it as a script, or you can just edit it in a text editor. So you don't necessarily need an IDE for it. I like this article, and it's a great way to kind of show off, a lot of the themes that we've talked about this year, this idea of like thinking about your design before just diving into it. And I feel like Akshay did a really good job with that. And he was a great guest. So definitely check out that episode if you haven't checked it out. What's your next one?
So in May of this year, we linked to an article by Stephen Gruppetta. I believe this was before we stole him away to Real Python. So see boys and girls, write good stuff, and someone might offer you a job.
Yeah.
Anyhow, this post is called "What's a Python Hashable Object?" Or more fully, the title is "Where's William? How quickly can you find him? What's a Python hashable object?" With the subtitle, you can ignore reading about hashable objects for quite a bit, but eventually it's worth having an idea of what they are. So, rather an all-encompassing title. Stephen likes to write using analogies, which can be quite helpful if you're trying to get a deeper understanding of some more obscure topics. This post talks about a fictitious character named Winston who has just started their first day on the job. Winston's trying to find someone in the mess of a cube farm at their new company, and there aren't a lot of cubes. Well, so you start out by going one by one. And then on his second day at the office, the number of cubes has changed, making a linear search more problematic. On his third day at the office, it's grown again. I think I want to own the moving company that has the contract for this place. It sounds kind of lucrative.
Some good work. Yeah.
Anyways, in order to better solve the problem of finding his boss in this mess of cubes, Winston creates a mapping between people's names and their cube numbers. Instead of just keeping an alphabetized list, Winston creates a code. He uses the ASCII code for each letter in a person's name and then sums the values. That single integer then becomes a code for the person, which he then maps to their cube. The advantage of doing this is a very quick lookup. So with an alphabetic list, I'd have to know how many A entries there are to be able to skip quickly to B. But with this mechanism, as long as I'm okay with using some extra memory, I can skip to the index of that code very, very quickly. And I'm sure you're ahead of me. This kind of code is called a hash, and it's the foundation of how the dict class in Python works. The sum of ASCII codes mechanism is called a hash function. Python has its own, it doesn't use this. And the rest of the article goes on to show you how the real Python hash function gets used, what it means for object equality, what a hash collision is, and a whole bunch more. So if you've ever wanted to learn more about how this stuff works under the hood, this article is very approachable and a good way to achieve better understanding. See, there's a call back to the second step in Bloom's taxonomy. So how's that?
Nice. Yeah, I had Stephen on the show, episode 203, and we talked about his writing style. I titled it Embarking on a Relaxed and Friendly Python Coding Journey. He likes analogies, he likes metaphors, he likes characters and sort of narrative ways of explaining stuff. And so it's always fun. And yeah, it's great to have him on our team. He's part of the core team. He's done a couple video courses, so I've worked with him on some of that stuff. And he's got some really exciting news for real Python coming up. In fact, next week, you'll hear a lot more about it. We're going to dig into, instead of doing a wrap up on what was happening at Real Python in 2024, we're going to instead look forward and talk about what are the structures that we're building for Real Python moving forward into 2025, and pretty excited about. He's also another good person to follow on Bluesky. So there's the Bluesky call out again. Yeah, so as mentioned before, I decided to include this one from February, which I think is probably the first time everybody started hearing about this thing called UV. It's titled UV, Python Packaging in Rust. And what can I say? This is the thing that I've heard talked about the absolute most this year is UV and people using it and figuring out how to use it. And I, as you might have heard a couple episodes ago, started playing with it myself. I'm still figuring out different things with it, but I figured with a new computer, maybe I'll try out this new tool and see it's working out. They have a TLDR at the top of the article, which I think is very good. UV is an extremely fast Python package installer and resolver written in Rust, designed as a drop-in replacement for pip and pip tools. It represents a milestone in their pursuit for this sort of idea of cargo for Python. Cargo is the package management tool for Rust. It's a comprehensive Python project and it's fast, like they like to mention a lot, reliable and easy to use. Things it can do, it can behave as pip. It can behave as a lot of the stuff out of pip tools, virtual env, pipx, which I've mentioned. There's a UVX feature where you can kind of do this sort of installable stuff. So yeah, virtual environments, Python dependencies, all that sort of stuff in one. A part of the vision came from at the end of last year. Armin Ronacher was the creator of Flask. Again, I'm doing lots of shout outs to the episodes I've had people on the show, but he was back in the first year of the show, episode 18. He came on talking about 10 years of Flask. This particular tool that he built was called Rye, which was an experimental project about project management, the idea of sort of tying lots of ideas together. And they were able to take a lot of those ideas and bring them on board inside of UV. It's kind of an announcement post, but also has benchmarks. It has lots of the other features. It's like this, a bit of a landing page, if you will, for like, okay, what is UV and what can it do? So if you haven't dug in and learned a little bit about it yet, I think this is a good starting place for learning about UV. And I have one honorable mention that I wanted to throw in here. I'm very excited to have Ricky White back doing some stuff, doing some writing for us at Real Python. Speaking of Astral, he did an article about Rough, and that's the code formatter that everybody was talking about last year. Very, very fast, combines things like Black, iSort, Placate, all those kinds of tools like that. So he did an article about that, but this is one that I guess I'm kind of leaving it at not necessarily like I've dug into it deeply. It's one that I want to read more and learn more about, and I'll leave it with you as like a project maybe you could kind of check out on your own. It's titled CI/CD for Python with GitHub Actions. And I've been interested in learning more, not only about continuous integration and continuous deployment, the CI/CD of it all, but explicitly in a place that I can play with it without too much investment, and that's doing it in GitHub and with GitHub workflows and GitHub Actions. So this digs really deep into that. Talks a lot about workflow triggers, workflow jobs, workflow steps, using GitHub Actions specifically with Python, creating automated testing workflows, testing on multiple versions of Python, and then eventually getting into publishing your package to PyPI and crucial detail stuff that's in there, accessing GitHub environment variables. and then automating security and dependency updates. So I think it'll be an interesting read for anybody who's looking to learn a little more about CI/CD. And I'm glad to see Ricky writing for us again, and hope he keeps writing because he likes to do lots of hands-on stuff, and I definitely dig that stuff here. I guess that brings us to the end of our wrap-up.
Look at that. We've rung in the new year.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to visiting with you and talking more PyCoders across 2025 here again, Christopher.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Cheers.
I want to thank Christopher Trudeau for coming on the show again. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and look forward to talking to you soon.